You're excited, I'm excited, Zelda fans, we are getting a sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. But we've known that for 2 years now, but it seems that it's going to be closer and closer to release. This game looks to be bigger and better in various aspects compared to the original, but I'm here to say that you should be really hyped when it comes to the story of Breath of the Wild 2, which I feel is going to be immensely bigger and better. When looking at the story of Breath of the Wild, sure, it is my favorite game of all time, but when it comes to the weaker aspects of the game, the story was definitely one of the bumpier rides. And that's for a number of reasons. Personally, I didn't think the story of Breath of the Wild was bad. Its presentation was definitely not optimal, especially considering that despite its stakes, the core of the story was very much a personal one that was only fleshed out beyond that by the world around it. So that gives many the idea of it being uneven. And with that in mind, you would think that Breath of the Wild 2 story would follow suit and not be as inspirational as other Zelda games. Wrong, I believe it's going to be quite the opposite. What's up guys, it's HMK once again with another Breath of the Wild 2 video aimed to get you hyped for the aspects and prospects of the story of Breath of the Wild 2 and how it could be infinitely more grand than the original. Strap on in for the safety of hype, be sure to hit that like and subscribe, and let's dive directly into the noise. So going off what we know with the original story of Breath of the Wild, why would I think that Breath of the Wild 2 story is going to be that much grander than the original? Well, the thing is, Breath of the Wild, as great as it was in all intents and purposes, was a test. Oh man, and a successful test. But it really was. Breath of the Wild was a test on multiple fronts when it comes to changing up the Zelda formula, testing out new physics engines, and literally giving us Nintendo's take on the open world genre, transforming it into the open air genre. So with all of these new ideas flourishing about the gameplay and the approach to the gameplay itself, it's very understandable that other aspects, such as the story, would take a back seat. And I'm talking way in the backseat. And honestly, that in itself, with the exception of some games like Skyward Sword, is the core developmental aspect when it comes to Legend of Zelda games. Gameplay first, deciding the story later. But for Breath of the Wild, they took this approach to the maximum. With the core of the game dealing with exploration and harkening back to the first Zelda game, it's understandable for this approach. But when considering this, the story wasn't the only thing to suffer. You know, enemies, design, other factors, it felt like an afterthought when you look at the grand scheme of things. But trust me, this is going to be different when it comes to Breath of the Wild 2. Of course, you would think off the top of your head that off the bat, since this is a sequel, Nintendo's going to work out all of the kinks from the original, despite how great it was. I mean, they've done so before. But even still, the trailers of Breath of the Wild 2 tell us that not only an idea like this is on the table, but it's probably going to be one of the highest priorities. With the first trailer looking to be a story teaser, and the second trailer to offer more story tidbits with some gameplay. But I mean that Sky though, Skyward Sword anyone? Although Breath of the Wild had some really good characterization, the story itself couldn't really stand on its own. With Breath of the Wild 2, I believe that's going to be different, as the core of the identity of Breath of the Wild has been figured out. And with that out of the way, Breath of the Wild 2 already has some big additions that will shape up a more grand story, such as our boy Ganondorf. The addition of this character alone, who by the way hasn't really been in a Zelda game since Twilight Princess, will be the driving point for a better and bigger story due to his immense ambition for another aspect I feel is a lock-in for Breath of the Wild, and that is the Triforce. These two narrative points alone are incredibly rich with Zelda lore, due to the massive importance of their history throughout the Zelda games. And I think it's pretty funny that Skyward Sword HD was launched ahead of Breath of the Wild 2 in order to set up Ganondorf and the Malice's origin within that of Demise, and the importance of all things holy within that of the Legend of Zelda, including the Golden Goddesses, the Goddess Hylia, the Master Sword, and of course the essence of the gods themselves, the Triforce. As when we're dealing with Ganondorf, the human side of Ganon, his conquest is a lot more concise, given that he can think, plan, and of course, hopefully, speak. Speaking of which, who would you want to voice Ganondorf in Breath of the Wild 2? Let's go, Paul St. Peter. And you know, all of this is not even counting the new story that will be present in Breath of the Wild 2 and what we have to go off of in the original Breath of the Wild. And that really is the duality of the argument I'm trying to present. In Breath of the Wild, it was Link, Zelda, and Hyrule versus the big blob of evil, and how they lost. And while I'm being reductive, that's pretty much it when it comes to Breath of the Wild story. But now with Breath of the Wild 2, we have to deal with Ganondorf, a powerful sorcerer and tactical genius that has literally launched wars in the games he's been in the past. Check my math. In Ocarina of Time, he launched a war against the royal family and Hyrule itself, and won, conquering Hyrule and becoming the Great King of Evil. In the Wind Waker, he basically was the one ruling the seas from afar, and was the one who led the war that effectively got Hyrule flooded in the adult timeline. And in Twilight Princess, although he was the man behind the curtain, he instigated the Twilight War in the Light Realm, and won. So when you have someone like this returning in Breath of the Wild 2, you already know things are going to go down. Bad things. Well, bad for us? No. Bad for the people in the game? Yeah. And when talking about Ganondorf, his quest for the Triforce, of course that means that the story itself, when it comes to how we digest it, is probably going to be retooled a bit. While of course you will want to retain the identity of Breath of the Wild, in which you want to go ahead and complete the story in pretty much any order you want it to, the linearity of heading to the final fight will more likely be reshaped due to the floating castle that we saw in the trailers. As I feel that Nintendo will probably find a way to make it so that you must accomplish certain objectives first, such as missions A through Z, before you can access the castle, unlike the first game in which you could just bum rush all the way to Hyrule Castle from the beginning. While I think this is going to turn some people off, I feel it's going to be better in the long run given a more concentrated approach. That way, a bigger, grander, and more fuller story can be presented to us. As while you will have the choice to tackle any dungeon in any order except the final one, the story can be advanced by completing each dungeon, completing a certain threshold of dungeons, discovering new areas leading to dungeons, and of course culminating leading up to the finale once you've cleared the base prerequisites. And we've seen Nintendo handle this approach somewhat in A Link Between Worlds. Now imagine that, but bigger. No more of that hanky-panky memory hunting BS, but I mean, if you want to apply that to Ganondorf's memories, that would be cool. So when you complete the story dungeons in any order, that leads to the story advancement that will unlock a path to the final dungeon, the floating Hyrule Castle, which is giving me quite the Ocarina of Time vibes there. Going off what we've seen already, the stakes will be much higher off the bat, inherently. As Ganondorf is awake, Zelda seems to be lost, Link literally lost an arm, and unlike in the original Breath of the Wild where we're trying to prevent the utter destruction of the world by this calamity, it seems that Ganondorf will actively be up to no good. And while we know enough about the calamity that is Calamity Ganon, we don't know much about how that applies to Ganondorf during this day and age, being 10,000 years plus ahead of whatever Zelda game came before Breath of the Wild. And with Ganondorf being up and about, I feel that we're finally going to learn the truth of the timeline when it comes to how it applies to Breath of the Wild and Breath of the Wild 2, of course. And of course, it's the smaller things that I feel is going to be equally juicy. How did Ganondorf end up like this? Who sealed him? Where did that arm come from? Why was Zelda and Link in the depths to begin with? Where's all the Sheikah technology? What's with the islands in the sky? How does that apply to Breath of the Wild and Breath of the Wild 2? But honestly, I feel that the biggest indicator that's going to show how big the story of Breath of the Wild 2 is going to be is filling in all of the holes that were missing from the lore in the original Breath of the Wild, especially considering the Triforce and the sacred sealing power that the princesses of Hyrule are supposed to be born with, and what exactly led to this cycle of preventing the calamity. If those ominous hieroglyphics is anything to go off of in the first Breath of the Wild 2 trailer, I feel that we're truly in for a doozy. But for me, Ganondorf taking center stage in Breath of the Wild 2 is a gigantic deal. I know it, Nintendo knows it, but I want to make sure that you guys understand how big of a deal this is. Because the return of the Great King of Evil is truly going to make the calamity look like playtime. With that being said, I want to know what you guys think. Do you believe that Breath of the Wild 2 story is going to be bigger, better, and grander? I'm pretty sure it's going to be. Leave your thoughts and theories in the comment section below. And while you're at it, like the video, share it up with your friends, and subscribe while hitting that bell. It really helps out the channel. Big thanks to my Patreon supporters for helping making this video happen. If you want to find out how you can support HMK for just $1 a month, check out my info in the description box below. Alright guys, until the next Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 video, this has been HMK, and I'll check you guys later.